It was a bright, crisp afternoon when the man pulled his car onto the city's busy streets. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows on the pavement, and the streets were alive with people rushing about their daily business. For the man, it was just another day in the city, no different from any other. He was dressed casually, a simple t-shirt and jeans, enjoying the cool breeze through the open window of his car. He was a regular guy, someone who lived in the city and worked a regular job. Nothing about him stood out except maybe the fact that he enjoyed a little peace and quiet when he could find it. As he drove, his mind was on the tasks ahead, picking up groceries, getting some errands done, and maybe heading to the park for a short walk. The hustle of the city had a way of draining you, and he cherished the few moments of solitude he could find. But as he rounded a corner and approached a stoplight, something in the rearview mirror caught his eye. It was a police car. The flashing lights, the sirens, it wasn't too loud, but it was enough to make anyone aware that something was happening. The car pulled in right behind him, and for a moment the man didn't think much of it. There were plenty of officers in the area doing their job. He wasn't doing anything wrong, so it didn't seem like anything to worry about. Then the officer behind him turned on the siren, louder this time, and the flashing lights flickered in his mirror. He sighed, shifting his car to the side of the road, pulling over in a quiet area away from the street noise. His heart rate picked up a little, but he was calm. He'd been stopped by cops before. It wasn't unusual, even though he didn't quite understand why. The officer got out of the car, his steps firm and quick. He didn't smile or wave as he walked toward the man's vehicle. The man could already tell something about this officer was off. Maybe it was the rigidness in his posture, the way his eyes stayed fixed ahead, or the strange look in his face. Cold, maybe even distant. But that wasn't unusual, right? Not all police officers were friendly, and that didn't necessarily mean something bad. The officer approached the car, his expression unreadable, and stopped at the window. He didn't say hello or how are you doing today. It was straight to business. The officer's tone was sharp, his voice flat as he demanded to see the man's driver's license and registration. The man's hands moved quickly, reaching for the glove compartment, grabbing the papers and handing them over. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his voice calm but a little cautious. "You were driving a little too fast," the officer said, eyeing him up and down, his voice still firm. "I'll need you to step out of the vehicle." The man blinked, taken aback by the request. He hadn't noticed anything out of the ordinary while driving, but he did as he was told. He reached for the door handle and stepped out of the car, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. His heart was pounding now, but he tried not to let his nerves show. There was no reason to be anxious. He hadn't done anything wrong. The officer didn't give him a chance to ask more questions. He didn't explain why the man had been pulled over, and his tone didn't invite conversation. He simply stood there watching the man as if waiting for something. The officer's eyes were cold, scanning him from head to toe. It felt like the officer was seeing more than just a man standing in front of him, like he was trying to figure something out. The man couldn't help but feel a twinge of discomfort. Something about the officer's demeanor didn't sit right with him, but he didn't want to escalate things. "What's this about?" the man asked again, hoping for some clarity. "Just step to the side," the officer replied curtly. "I need to ask you a few questions." The man did as he was asked, stepping away from the car, his mind racing. His thoughts were muddled. Why was this happening? He wasn't speeding, wasn't breaking any rules. Why had the officer pulled him over in the first place? And why was he acting so hostile? The officer stood a few feet away, keeping a steady distance. He watched the man carefully, almost as if studying him. The air felt thicker now, heavy with unspoken tension. The man started to feel the pressure building, not from fear of getting in trouble, but because he was starting to sense something wasn't right. "Where are you headed?" the officer asked, his voice now laced with suspicion. "I'm just running errands," the man replied, trying to sound casual. "Nothing special." The officer narrowed his eyes. "And why are you in this part of town?" The man paused for a moment, confused by the question. "I live here. Just a normal area. I'm not doing anything wrong." But the officer wasn't listening. His eyes were now sharp, more focused on the man's every movement. He was looking at him differently, as if he didn't trust him. The officer's body language was growing more aggressive, and the man could feel his stomach tighten. "Let me see your ID," the officer demanded suddenly, his voice rising slightly. The man was confused. "I already gave you my driver's license and registration." Why do you need more? The officer ignored the question, now sounding more impatient. I'll need to check your ID, he repeated. At this point, the man's gut instinct was telling him that something was off. There was a feeling of being singled out, treated differently. Why was the officer being so aggressive? What had he done to warrant this kind of treatment? His nerves were getting the best of him, but he kept his voice steady. I'm just a regular guy. I don't know what this is about. The officer didn't respond. He just stood there, his eyes still locked on the man, making him feel more uncomfortable by the second. The silence between them felt heavy, and the man could feel himself being scrutinized, judged. It wasn't just the traffic stop anymore. It was something more. Finally, the officer sighed. I'm going to search your vehicle. What? Why? The man asked, genuinely puzzled. I haven't done anything wrong. But the officer wasn't having it. He stepped forward, his hand on his holster. You can either cooperate or I'll have to call for backup, he warned, his voice still firm, as if he were dealing with a criminal instead of someone who simply didn't understand what was happening. The man's heart raced, but he didn't back down. He was calm, trying to stay in control. He wasn't about to let this go without knowing why. Am I being detained? Or can I go? The officer didn't answer right away. He simply stood there staring at the man. The tension in the air was palpable. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the officer turned to walk back to his patrol car, presumably to call for backup. The man stood there trying to make sense of it all. What had just happened? Why was he being treated this way? What had caused the officer to act so aggressively, to search his vehicle for no apparent reason? As he stood alone in the silence of the street, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a traffic stop gone wrong. Something was definitely off, and he was about to find out just how deep this problem really went. The officer walked back to his patrol car, leaving the man standing alone on the side of the road. It was a strange feeling. The man stood there, his heart still racing, but his mind trying to make sense of everything that was happening. He hadn't done anything wrong. In fact, he wasn't even sure why the officer had stopped him in the first place. There hadn't been any speeding, no illegal maneuvers, nothing that should have drawn attention to him. And yet here he was, standing on the side of the road being treated like a criminal. He glanced around, hoping that someone else would see what was going on. Maybe a passing car or pedestrian would notice the oddness of it all. But there was nothing. Just the same city streets, the same rush of people on the sidewalk. No one seemed to care. It made him feel even more isolated. The officer returned to the scene a few moments later. The man noticed that his posture had shifted, like he was getting ready for something. The officer wasn't just going to let him go easily. That much was clear. The man's gut twisted. What did he have planned? He wanted to ask the officer again what was going on, but the words caught in his throat. The tension was too thick now. It was as if anything he said would only make things worse. Without a word, the officer motioned for the man to move closer. I need to search your vehicle, the officer repeated, his voice cold and demanding. The man stood still processing what was happening. He had never experienced something like this before. Sure, he'd seen things on the news. He'd heard stories of people being unfairly treated. But to be in this situation himself was something entirely different. It was unsettling. And despite his calm exterior, inside he felt the pull of anxiety. There was no reason for this. But no matter how much he tried to reason with himself, it didn't change the fact that the officer was still standing there, blocking him from leaving. I don't understand, the man finally said, his voice quieter now. Why do you need to search my car? I haven't done anything wrong. The officer didn't respond right away. He just stared at him, his eyes narrowed, as if deciding whether or not to answer. It felt like a game to the officer, but for the man it wasn't a game at all. His future, his reputation, everything felt like it was on the line. He had every right to question why he was being treated this way. But the officer didn't seem interested in answering. Instead, the officer moved closer to the man's car, his eyes scanning the surroundings like a hawk looking for its prey. Let's make this easy, the officer said, his voice still carrying that edge. Get in the back of my car. We'll sort this out at the station. The man's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just a random stop anymore. It was an arrest. He had seen it on TV, heard about it from friends, but never imagined it would happen to him. He wasn't some hardened criminal, just a guy minding his own business. Yet here he was, about to be carted off to the station as if he were guilty of something. "I'm not going anywhere with you until you tell me what this is about," the man said firmly, trying to regain control of the situation, but the officer wasn't listening. He just gave a stiff nod and reached for his handcuffs. The sound of the cuffs snapping open filled the air like a quiet but deadly warning. The man froze for a moment. Was this really happening? It was almost surreal, like he was living in someone else's nightmare. His mind raced with thoughts, trying to understand how things had gotten so out of hand. He tried to remind himself that he hadn't done anything to deserve this. There had to be a mistake, right? "Don't make this harder than it has to be," the officer warned, his voice now laced with frustration. "I don't have time to play games." The officer's hand reached for the man's arm and the man instinctively pulled back, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. But the officer was insistent, grabbing his wrist and twisting it behind his back. With a swift motion, the handcuffs were locked in place. The man winced at the pressure, but there was nothing he could do. He felt completely powerless, like a puppet with his strings pulled tight. The officer gave a half-hearted apology, one that seemed almost mechanical. "Just doing my job," he muttered, as if that was supposed to make everything okay. But the man wasn't buying it. His thoughts were racing now, not just with confusion, but with anger. He was angry that this was happening to him. Angry that the officer seemed to think it was okay to treat him like this just because of his race. The way the officer had been eyeing him, the way he assumed the worst, it wasn't lost on him. It wasn't just an ordinary stop. This was something more. The man was pushed toward the back of the police car, his movement stiff as if the world around him had slowed to a crawl. As the door slammed shut behind him, he felt a rush of cold air and the unsettling sense of being trapped. There was no escape now. His mind began to wonder how far this would go. Would he be thrown in jail for something he didn't do? What was going to happen next? The officer started to radio for backup, his voice clear but tight. The words felt foreign to the man. Detention, search, possible charges. None of it made sense. He felt his body tense with the realization that he was about to be processed for something that wasn't even a crime. His frustration was building and there was no outlet to release it. All he could do was sit there, his back against the hard seat of the police car as the officer's words echoed in his mind. But then, something strange happened. As the minutes ticked by, the man began to feel a strange sense of clarity. This wasn't just a bad experience. This wasn't just about him being pulled over for no reason. It was about something deeper. The officer wasn't just mistreating him. He was acting on assumptions that had nothing to do with reality. He was stereotyping, profiling, and making decisions based on things that were completely unfounded. The man understood in that moment that this wasn't just his fight. It was bigger than him. This was about the systems in place, the biases that ran deep in society. It was about racial injustice. He knew that something had to change. This wasn't something that would be fixed overnight, but moments like this, moments where people stood up for what was right, were what changed the world. Even if he was just one person, even if he didn't have the power to stop the officer in his tracks, his story mattered. The officer finished his radio call and returned to the car. As the car started up, the man looked out the window, his thoughts still swirling. He didn't know what would happen next, but he did know one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let this moment be forgotten. He wasn't going to let the officer think this was just a small mistake. This was part of a larger problem, and he knew that somehow, some way, this moment would be part of the change that needed to happen. As the car made its way toward the station, the man sat in silence, waiting for whatever came next. His mind was set. The journey wasn't over yet. The truth would come out. He was determined to make sure of it. The police car hummed steadily as it drove through the city streets. The man sat in the back, his hands still cuffed, pressed against the cold metal of the seat. Every few moments the car would shift as the officer turned corners or hit the gas, but it felt as if time had slowed to a crawl. The man's mind raced, bouncing between thoughts of confusion, frustration, and anger. He had no idea why this was happening. He had done nothing to deserve being treated like a criminal. The officer didn't say much. The radio crackled with static, followed by brief exchanges between dispatch and other officers. It seemed like the officer wasn't even focused on the road. His attention was elsewhere, maybe on whatever reason he had to pull over the man in the first place. The silence in the car was almost deafening, but it gave the man plenty of time to think. Each bump of the road, each shift of the car made him feel like he was moving deeper into a situation he couldn't get out of. He glanced through the small window of the police car, watching the city pass by. People were going about their business, oblivious to what was happening to him. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting an orange glow over the buildings. For a brief moment, he felt like he was in a dream. It couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of mistake, a misunderstanding that would be sorted out as soon as they got to the station. But deep down, he feared this wasn't going to be that simple. He had a sinking feeling in his gut, one that told him things were about to get worse before they got better. And as the officer turned onto a street with the police station in sight, that fear grew stronger. The police station loomed ahead, a stark, intimidating building that seemed to cast a shadow over the entire block. The man felt his stomach tighten as the car slowed to a stop in front of the entrance. His heart was beating louder now, a constant thrum in his chest. He could feel the weight of the situation closing in around him. No one had told him what was going on. No one had explained why he was being treated like this. The officer parked the car and got out without a word. The man watched through the small partition as the officer approached the building. For a few moments he was left alone in the back of the car, the silence pressing down on him. He could hear his own breathing, steady but heavy, as he tried to calm himself. It didn't help. The anxiety was overwhelming. The door opened and the officer returned to the car, his face hard, unreadable. He didn't even glance at the man as he moved to open the back door. The officer wasn't in a hurry, but his movements were sharp, almost mechanical. He reached inside and, without a word, pulled the man out of the car and led him toward the entrance. Every step felt heavier than the last. The cold air outside hit the man's face, and for a moment it brought him back to reality. He was here at the police station, and still no one had told him why. His thoughts kept racing, but he couldn't quiet the nagging feeling that something was wrong, something deeper than just a simple traffic stop. As they entered the station, the man noticed the officers behind the desk and the noise of paperwork and phone calls in the background. It felt like a factory of routine, a place where people were processed, treated like numbers, not individuals. The man's eyes flickered around, his thoughts still spinning, trying to make sense of the situation. The officer who had arrested him walked up to the front desk, and the man was left standing there, his arms still behind his back. He felt exposed, vulnerable. The officer exchanged a few words with the desk sergeant, but the man couldn't hear what was being said. It didn't matter. He wasn't interested in their conversation. He was focused on what was coming next. A few moments later, the officer turned back to the man and motioned for him to follow. "Let's go," the officer muttered, his tone clipped. The man followed, his shoes tapping softly on the tiled floor, each step dragging him closer to what he feared would be a long, exhausting process. They walked down a hallway that seemed endless. The walls were bare, the fluorescent lights above flickered intermittently. The man tried to stay calm, but his mind was a blur of thoughts. Was he going to be thrown in jail? Was this the moment when his life would be changed forever? All because of an officer's misplaced suspicion? The officer stopped in front of a small room, opened the door, and gestured for the man to enter. The room was stark, with only a few chairs and a table. The man was shoved into a chair and the door clicked shut behind him. He was left alone in the room with nothing but his thoughts and the sound of his own heartbeat. It felt like being trapped in a box. Minutes passed and the door swung open once more. Another officer entered, a woman this time. She was in her late 30s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She stood at the door for a moment, looking at the man like she was deciding how to handle him. "I'm Officer Garcia," she said, her voice firm. "I'll be the one to talk to you. Now let's get this over with." She didn't waste any time. She sat across from the man, taking out a notebook and a pen. "You're under arrest for suspicion of illegal activity," she said bluntly. "But we need to know who you really are and why you're in this neighborhood." The man's head spun. This couldn't be happening. It felt like a bad dream. He opened his mouth to protest, but the words got stuck. "I haven't done anything wrong," he finally said, his voice shaking slightly. "I was just driving. I was minding my own business." Officer Garcia didn't respond immediately. She just stared at him, her gaze unwavering. "That's not what the officer who stopped you said. He said you were acting suspicious. That you were in an area you shouldn't be. We've got to get to the bottom of this." The man felt like he was drowning. This wasn't real. How could this be happening? He had never been in trouble with the law before, and now he was being accused of something he hadn't done. There was no way out. He didn't know how to make them understand, how to explain that he was just a regular guy, but Garcia didn't seem interested in hearing his side of the story. "Tell me your name," she said, her pen poised to write. He hesitated for a moment. It wasn't just about his name anymore. It was about how he was being treated, the way his identity was being questioned simply because of his appearance. He took a deep breath and said his name slowly, carefully. But it wasn't enough. The officer seemed to be waiting for more. She asked for his address, his phone number, where he worked, everything. He answered each question, his frustration growing with each one. How many times did he have to prove he was who he said he was? He wasn't a criminal. He was just a man in the wrong place at the wrong time. The conversation dragged on, and the man felt more and more like a pawn in a game that he didn't understand. Every word seemed to be weighed against him, as if they were looking for a reason to charge him with something. The pressure was unbearable. Finally, Officer Garcia stood up, her chair scraping the floor. "We'll be in touch," she said curtly. "Don't leave town." And with that, she was gone, leaving the man alone again in the cold room, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. He wasn't free, but he wasn't in jail either. He was stuck in limbo, waiting for something to change, hoping that somewhere someone would see the truth of what was happening to him. The minutes dragged on like hours. The man sat in the small, sterile room, feeling the weight of the silence around him. His mind was spinning, still trying to understand how everything had gone so wrong. He couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped in a nightmare. The more he thought about the officer's actions, the more the anger bubbled up inside of him. He had been stopped for no reason, treated like a criminal, and now he was stuck in this room waiting for whatever was coming next. It felt like time had stopped completely. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, and every so often the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway outside. He kept his hands tightly clasped in front of him, trying to steady his nerves. What was going to happen? Would they release him? Would they come up with some charge to keep him here? His thoughts bounced between worry and frustration, but he didn't know which one to focus on. It wasn't just the fact that he was being treated unfairly. It was the way everything felt so routine to the officers. To them, this was just another arrest, just another person to process. But to him, it was everything. His entire day had been upended. His life had been thrown into chaos. And for what? He had done nothing wrong. He couldn't understand why they were treating him like this. Suddenly, the door to the room opened again. The man looked up quickly, his heart skipping a beat. Officer Garcia stepped inside, followed by a man in a suit. The man was older, his face lined with age and experience. He had a serious expression, and the way he carried himself suggested that he was someone with authority. The man wasn't sure what was going on, but the new arrival gave off a different vibe than the officers he'd encountered so far. There was something about him that seemed more official, more concerned with the process than just the job of arresting him. "Good evening," the man in the suit said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm Detective Foster. I'll be taking over from here." The man didn't know whether to feel relieved or more nervous. On one hand, the fact that someone else was involved could mean things were about to be handled more seriously. On the other hand, what did it mean for him? Was this going to get worse? Detective Foster didn't waste any time. He pulled out a chair and sat across from the man, folding his hands on the table in front of him. His eyes were focused but not unkind. There was something steady about his gaze, something that gave the man a tiny sense of hope that maybe, just maybe, he'd get a fair shot at explaining himself. "I understand you've been confused about the situation," Foster said, his voice steady. "And I want to get to the bottom of this. So let's start with the basics. Tell me your full name and we'll go from there." The man took a deep breath. His throat felt dry, but he nodded and slowly gave the detective his name. He didn't know how much explaining would make a difference, but at this point, he had to try. He had to believe that if he just kept telling the truth, things would eventually sort themselves out. Foster nodded as the man spoke, his expression never changing. He wasn't writing anything down, just listening. There was a stillness about the detective that made the man feel like he was actually being heard. It was a relief, even if it didn't mean the situation was over. "I'm not a criminal," the man said, his voice rising slightly. I'm just a regular person. I don't understand why I was pulled over, why the officer was so aggressive. This is all a mistake. Foster leaned back in his chair slightly, his gaze never leaving the man. I believe you, he said calmly. But sometimes things get misinterpreted. We need to figure out what happened here and where things went wrong. It sounds like the officer who stopped you might have acted on assumptions, but we can't be sure just yet. The man's frustration flared again. Assumptions. It was always the same. Why was it so easy for people to assume the worst just because of his race? Why was it always him and others like him, who had to prove their innocence while others got the benefit of the doubt? But he held his tongue. Foster seemed to be on his side, and the man didn't want to mess this up. I just don't get it, he said quietly, his shoulders slumping. I'm just going about my day, and suddenly I'm being treated like I'm doing something wrong. Foster nodded as if he understood. I know, but this situation is complicated. We'll get to the bottom of it. The most important thing now is that we figure out who you really are and make sure everything checks out. The man nodded slowly, feeling a bit more at ease now that he was being treated like a person. He didn't know how long it would take, but he had to trust that Detective Foster would figure things out. After all, it seemed like Foster was the first person who truly understood how important it was for this to be resolved fairly. Just as the man was about to say something more, the door opened again, and Officer Garcia stepped back in holding a clipboard. She didn't look happy, but she also didn't look angry. Her face was neutral, but there was a hint of hesitation in her eyes. Detective, she said, glancing at the man briefly before focusing on Foster. We've run the background check. It's come back. Well, it's come back clear. The guy's clean. Foster's eyebrows raised, but he didn't seem surprised. So what's the holdup then? He asked, his voice steady. Officer Garcia paused, then spoke, her voice tight. He says he's an FBI agent. The man's eyes widened. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. What was going on? Why would Garcia say that like it was some kind of accusation? Was this some kind of joke? Foster looked at Garcia, his face impassive. And nothing, Garcia snapped, clearly frustrated. I think he's lying. I think he's just trying to get out of this. This whole thing smells fishy. Foster didn't react immediately. He just sat there, staring at the man for a long moment, as if weighing his words carefully. Finally, he spoke. You're saying you're an FBI agent? The man nodded slowly. Yes, I've been undercover for a long time. I've been working a case. I can't explain it all right now, but I need you to understand that I was never supposed to be out in the open like this. Foster leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. That's a big claim, and right now it's difficult to verify. But I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt. Let's see where this goes. The man exhaled sharply, relief washing over him. For the first time since all this started, he felt like someone believed him. Maybe things weren't as hopeless as they seemed. Maybe there was a chance for the truth to come out. Foster stood up, signaling for Officer Garcia to leave the room. We'll verify your story, but for now, we'll release you. We need to sort this out and figure out how this whole mess happened. As Garcia left the room, the man felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He still didn't know how everything would unfold, but for the first time, he wasn't completely trapped. There was hope. Hope that he would finally get the chance to clear his name and stop being treated like a criminal for no reason. The man sat in the small, dimly lit room, his mind still racing. He couldn't believe what had just happened. After what felt like hours of being questioned, a simple background check had cleared everything up. The officer who had first pulled him over, the one who had been so certain of his guilt, was nowhere to be found. And now Detective Foster had told him that he would be released, that he was no longer a suspect in anything. But even as the tension lifted from his chest, the relief was overshadowed by a lingering feeling of unease. He still couldn't shake the memory of the officer's cold attitude, the way he had been treated like a criminal simply because of his appearance, the way assumptions had clouded judgment. How many others had experienced the same thing? The door to the room opened and Detective Foster walked in again. This time, the detective's face looked a little less stern, though there was still a seriousness in his eyes. He pulled up a chair and sat down across from the man, his expression calm but thoughtful. I'm glad we were able to clear things up, Foster said, breaking the silence. I know it's been a frustrating experience for you, but now we need to talk about the bigger picture, about how this all happened. The man nodded slowly. He hadn't expected this. He thought he would just be let go, free to leave, and that would be the end of it. But now Foster seemed like he wanted to discuss what had gone wrong, and the man was more than willing to listen. "The officer who pulled you over," Foster continued, his voice steady. "He acted quickly, without fully understanding the situation. It's not uncommon for people in law enforcement to make assumptions, but that doesn't make it right. We're trained to follow procedure, to investigate without prejudice, but sometimes personal biases get in the way." The man sat up straighter. This was the conversation he had been waiting for, the one where someone finally acknowledged the issue at hand. It wasn't just a simple mistake. It was part of a bigger problem that affected countless people every day. And Foster was speaking about it with a level of awareness that made the man feel like he wasn't just another number on a police report. "Look, I don't know what your experience with law enforcement has been like before," Foster said, his voice softer now. "But I need you to understand something. This wasn't just about you. This is about how systemic issues like racial profiling still happen, no matter how much training we receive or how much we try to change." The man's chest tightened slightly. He wasn't sure if he was ready to have this kind of conversation. He had been through so much already, and it was difficult to keep reliving the anger and frustration he had felt earlier. But Foster's honesty made it feel like the right time. "I've had my own share of experiences with this kind of thing," the man finally said, his voice quiet but strong. "It's not the first time I've been treated like this. I've seen it happen to others too. It's hard to not feel like it's all just part of the way things are, like you're not supposed to question it, just accept it and move on." Foster's eyes softened. He leaned in slightly as if trying to convey understanding. "I get it. And that's exactly why we need to keep pushing for change. We need to recognize these patterns and do everything we can to break them. The kind of thing you experience today, it's not a one-time mistake. It's a reflection of something much bigger, and we all need to take responsibility for that." The man exhaled slowly, feeling a mix of relief and sorrow. It felt good to have someone listen, to know that someone else understood what he had been through. But at the same time, it was painful to confront the reality of how deep-rooted the problem was. It wasn't just about one bad officer or one bad incident. It was about a system that had allowed this kind of behavior to continue for far too long. "But it's not just the officers," Foster continued, his voice carrying the weight of his words. "It's the system as a whole. It's the way people are trained, the way communities are policed. It's how biases are embedded into the very fabric of law enforcement. And it's something we all need to work together to change." The man nodded, his eyes focused on the detective. It wasn't an easy thing to hear, but it was the truth. And for the first time, he felt like he wasn't alone in this fight. "I'll tell you this, though," Foster said, leaning back in his chair. "What happened today, what you went through, shouldn't have happened. It's a failure on our part. But now we have the chance to make it right. We have the chance to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." The man felt a spark of hope flicker inside him. He didn't know if things would truly change, if all of this talk would lead to real action. But hearing Foster speak like that with such conviction made him feel like there was a chance. "I want to make sure you're not leaving here with more questions than answers," Foster said, standing up and walking toward the door. "I'll be in touch with you soon. We'll get everything sorted out, and I'll make sure the right steps are taken. But for now, you're free to go." The man stood up slowly, still processing everything. For the first time in hours, he felt like he could breathe again. He wasn't going to be locked up. He wasn't going to be charged with something he didn't do. And even though the journey wasn't over, this felt like the beginning of something important. As he stepped out of the small room, Foster followed him down the hall. The man's thoughts were still swirling, but for the first time he felt like he had a sense of control over the situation. He had been a victim of prejudice, but now he was part of a larger conversation. A conversation about justice, about systemic change, about making sure that the truth was heard. When the man finally walked out of the station, the cool night air hit his face. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, taking in everything that had happened. It was a relief to be free, but the feeling of injustice still weighed on him. He had been lucky, but not everyone was. There were still people out there facing the same discrimination, the same profiling, the same mistreatment. And that was the thought that kept him going. He wasn't just doing this for himself. He was doing this for everyone who had been affected by the same issues. He was going to be a part of the change, even if he didn't know exactly how it would unfold. He was determined to make sure that no one else would have to experience what he had gone through. As he walked into the night, he felt the weight of his own resolve. The journey wasn't over. It had only just begun.